What's up, everyone? So today I want to talk about armor and shell penetration in War Thunder. This is a concept that I don't think a lot of people have a clear grasp on. You may already understand it. If so, that's great. But I know, talking to a lot of the guys in the Discord, there was at least one or two portions of this video that they just didn't know or were looking at the wrong way. And so, just before we get into things, this is going to be a slightly longer video. It should be about 20 minutes if I can fit it all in quickly. And that's because it's kind of in depth. It's covering a lot of topics. In general, we're going to take a look at the armor viewer here, discuss some of the aspects of it which are actually a bit misleading. We're going to talk about the different types of armor. We're going to talk about constructional slope angle versus angle of attack, effective thickness, calculating the amount of protection a plate will give, and finally we'll talk about shell penetration and how to actually calculate whether a shell will go through a plate or not. So for starters, we're going to jump right into the armor viewer, and I'm going to start really basic. So if you already know this, just bear with me. I just want to make sure we don't lose anybody later in the video. So for starters, we have the tank armor viewer here, and you can see it gives us 4 bits of information for each plate here. We have the type of armor, so rolled homogeneous, gun steel, cast, structural steel chassis, tracks, etc. We have the thickness of the plate, and that's measured like as the actual thickness, not taking into account the angling of the plate or anything of that sort. We have the effective thickness, which takes into the angling of the plate, but that's actually a bit misleading, and we'll get to that in a bit. And then we have the constructional armor slope angle, and the way to look at that is imagine there's a 90-degree. Gosh, I always do that. Imagine if there's a 90-degree line here. So the constructional armor slope angle is this angle in between that imaginary 90-degree line and the plate. So here we can see this plate here has a constructional armor slope angle of 40, and if you imagine your 90-degree line, you can see, yeah, that's about 40. And so yeah, that's how this armor viewer works. So the first thing I want to talk about is effective thickness and why you shouldn't look at effective thickness. In fact, effective thickness is only useful in one instance. So the effective thickness value we're given here isn't actually used by the game to calculate whether a shell will penetrate or not. It's purely given in this view mode to give you an idea of how much you want to angle your tank. So in this case, you would look at your tank and you can see, okay, well, this gives me about 120 millimeter of effective thickness on both sides, right? So this is the optimal angle for this tank. So that's all that effective thickness is good for. This isn't actually used by the game to calculate anything about whether a shell will hit. So this armor plate isn't treated as if it's 121 millimeters. It's actually still treated as 80 millimeters. And that's actually more realistic, and we'll get to that later. But just understand that effective thickness, the only reason to look at it is to identify how much you want to angle your tank in combat. I wouldn't look at it, and don't look at it and think like, if you're looking at the Panther from the front, don't look at it and think that you have 130 millimeters of effective armor here. It doesn't work that way. And we'll explain that towards the end of the video when we start talking about shells. So really, the true number that's taken into account is thickness. And in fact, it's thickness and the armor type. This is how you're going to figure out how much protection your tank has. So in the game, and we're not given this in the armor viewer here, but you can find this information on the War Thunder wiki, and it comes up every now and then on Reddit as well. In-game, you have different types of armor. You have rolled homogeneous, you have cast homogeneous, you have tracks, you have structural steel, and you have gun steel, and there's actually more, and we'll take a look at a few other tanks to show you all the different types. But each of these has a different armor rating, and this armor rating is multiplied by the thickness to calculate how much protection that plate will provide. So rolled homogeneous armor has an armor rating of 1.0, which means that you take 1.0, multiply it by 80 millimeters, and that provides an actual 80 millimeters of protection. However, this cupola over here is cast homogeneous armor, and cast homogeneous armor has an armor rating of 0.94. So in this case, instead of providing 80 millimeters of protection, it's actually going to provide, give me a second to calculate it on my phone, 75.2 millimeters of protection. So it's important to note that there are different strengths and weaknesses of armor in the game. And in fact, it gets even more specific when we look at things like gun steel, for example. Gun steel has different armor ratings depending on the type of shell to hit it. So if a kinetic round or I believe a chemical round. I'm not too sure, but I think a chemical round as well. If either of those hit the barrel, it has a 1.10 armor rating, which means this 25 millimeters actually performs like 27.5 millimeters. And then if a high explosive shell hits it, it has a 2.50 armor rating, which means that this 25 millimeters would actually perform, and I'm just doing all this on my phone because I hate math, at 62.5 millimeters. That's the protection that this provides against heat. So it's important to note, effective thickness, I wouldn't look at that. I would look at the thickness and understand, I mean, you don't have to understand the exact armor ratings, but understand at least, hey, this one is stronger or weaker than this plate, right? So this, for example, here would provide 62.5 millimeters of protection against high explosive. This 72.5 or whatever the number was, and this is a true 80 millimeters of protection. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'll go through a few of the other things, but I won't calculate them. I just want to briefly cover the armor ratings for you guys. Again, this is all on the War Thunder wiki, and I'll put it in the description below as well for you guys. So tank tracks have a 0.75 armor rating. Structural steel of chassis will have a 0.6 armor rating, and that's it for here on this Panther. We're going to take a look over at the American tanks real quick. We'll take a look at the M13 here. Customization. So now we're looking at the M16. So gun steel, or not gun steel, structural steel. Structural steel has a 0.45 armor rating, and this is, remember, this is different than the structural steel of chassis. This is slightly higher at 0.60 is what we said, right? Yeah, 0.60. So 0.60 for structural steel of chassis, and structural steel itself is just 0.45. Vehicle wheels, like car wheels and stuff of that sort, they have a 0.30 armor rating, and then and that I think covers it for most of the basics. Now we can start looking at some of the more modern stuff and covering that as well. We're going to hop over to the Russian side, take a look at the T-64 here. And one of the things I'm not going to discuss in this video is composite armor and spaced armors, because these, I'm not exactly sure how they work, and I've tried looking with the armor ratings and kind of calculating things out that way, and it doesn't add up with the equivalent protection in this box. My two theories at the moment are that maybe they're just taking the equivalent, because these are new tanks, and I don't know about this, but I know especially with the Challenger that's being introduced and the M1 Abrams that's being introduced, I'm pretty sure that the armor is still somewhat classified. So they might just be applying these values manually and not actually calculating, or not actually, you know, putting all of the things in here. Because like some of these, you know, there's like shards of glass in there and junk that it just, I don't think it would be, that maybe they just don't have access to that info. And also it's possible that maybe it's just too difficult to do in the engine. It would just require too many resources. But either way, if you're looking at protection for the composite armors and stuff, I would just take what it says in this box to be true. I think that they might manually set these, or if they don't, there's something else that there's other things going on in here that we're not given info on, or at least I don't have the info on. So going back to the regular armor types, it's important to note that modern tanks, so the T-64A, the MBT-70, the Challenger that's coming in, the Abrams that's coming in, I don't know what the cutoff date is for modern tanks, but I do know that so far it's considered the MBT-70, KPZ-70, T-64A, and Chieftain Mark 10, right? So I would assume that the new Leopard 2K, the Abrams and the Challenger one are also going to be in this category. Their armor is actually higher quality than the other tanks in the game. So their armor rating for rolled homogeneous armor is going to be 1.01, and their quality for cast homogeneous armor will be 0.98. So it's a slight improvement over their World War II and Korean counterparts. What else do we have here? So aluminum, that's basically next to worthless. It's 0.20 armor rating. Wood is actually pretty worthless. It's 0.08 armor rating. So, you know, a lot of people will look at this and they're like, oh, it's 100 millimeters of thickness. And even it looks, you know, yellow on this tank versus, you know, green here, but this actually provides less protection than this plate behind it. Even though it says 100 millimeters, this is only going to act as 8 millimeters of armor, where this will act as a true 45 millimeters of protection. So it's important to note that the wood doesn't actually give any real tangible benefit. And that's it for the modern stuff. There are some armor ratings for the components within, but I'm not going to discuss those because I don't know exactly how they work. But yeah, that's about it. I don't see anything else that we might be missing. Oh, gun optics. That's the only other one that I would say. That's a 0.4 armor rating. The rest of it, we have face hardened armor. I'm not sure where that occurs. 1.05 armor rating. We have, ERA. That is a 1.0 armor rating against kinetic and 3.5 armor rating. And according to this list, it says against spalling. So I'm not sure how that applies. But it does provide a little bit of protection for kinetic rounds. And that's about it. I don't think we're missing anything on that. Oh, high hardness rolled armor. That's a 1.25 armor rating. Again, not sure where that... I think it's in this composite armor, but I don't know if that appears on the outside of a tank anywhere. Anyway, that's it for the armor rating. So we can go back to... I'll bring that Panther back, and we'll start talking about some of the other aspects of armor. So where's that Panther? So we'll bring this Panther back. I was having an instance, and this is actually what prompted me to do this armor video and this deep dive here, when me and American guy were shooting at this Panther with the, I had the M4A1 FL10, and that shell has an effective thickness of 100, or has a penetration value of 168 millimeters if you're looking here and at 100 meters, right? So I was sitting here and I was trying to shoot a guy up close, right, with it, and he was head on to me, and we were very, very close to each other, and I couldn't penetrate him, and I was just like, what the hell? Like, my shell should have 168 millimeters at, at within 100 meters, right? And it's just not going through. I couldn't figure it out, but this video shed some light on that. So even though this says 130 millimeters effective thickness, we ignore that, right? So the way the game actually calculates it is it takes the thickness of the plate, multiplies that by the armor rating. So in this case, it's rolled homogeneous, so it'd still be 80. And then it doesn't take any effective thickness into account. Then it goes directly to the shell type you're using. So in this case, I was using the M4A1 FL10, right? And it takes a look at the shell type, and it looks at this table at the bottom here, the armor penetration, distance / angle of attack, right? And this table here is a very simplified and not as big table that it uses to figure out whether your shell is going to penetrate or not. So this table here basically shows that my shell, when it's attacking at a 30-degree angle, right, when it has a 30-degree angle of attack, can only penetrate a 75 millimeter thick plate. And if we remember, that Panther had an 80 millimeter thick plate, and so this explains why I was unable to penetrate it. So when we go back and we preview it here, you can see this plate, right, has a constructional slope angle of 55 degrees. So in an easy way, and this is only going to apply to if you're hitting something directly on. If you're hitting it at an angle, the angle of attack for your shell will be different. But if you're hitting, in this case I was hitting him, straight on. If you're hitting a tank like that, right, you can take a look at the constructional armor slope angle and just subtract 90, right, or subtract it from 90. So in this case, if we subtract 55 from 90, we can see that, gosh, my math skills, that 35 degrees is going to be the angle of attack for my shell, which is awfully close to that 75 millimeter number, which explains why I couldn't penetrate, because this plate is 80 millimeters thick. That's why I couldn't penetrate. Now, if this plate was made of cast homogeneous armor, remember that dropped the armor, because the armor rating is 0.94, that dropped the thickness, or the protection I should say, to around 75 millimeters. So if this plate was cast homogeneous, I would actually go through it. And this is what happened with the Tiger IIs that everybody was upset about with the that's not what I meant to do. This happened with the Tiger IIs that everybody was upset about that nerf that got removed, right? Is this plate up here was cast homogeneous armor, and now it's rolled homogeneous armor. So this plate was actually 0.06% less effective. But when we calculate the number, 185 millimeters, right, times 0.94, you can see that that dropped to 173.9 millimeters. So that's a drop of, what, 11 points right there? So 11 millimeters of protection was lost when this was considered cast homogeneous versus the rolled homogeneous it's considered now. So that's how that works. And sometimes they do change those plates for balancing reasons. So they leave the effective thickness the same, but they'll change the type of armor. So it's important to, I mean, if you guys are wanting to keep Gaijin, and I think sometimes it's important to balance this game. So I'm not necessarily saying that I complain about that Tiger 2 nerf, But if you guys were upset about it, then you can keep Gaijin honest about things by looking at the type of armor that things are considered and seeing if that lines up with what it actually was in real life. But anyway, so that's kind of the overview of armor, and that's how shell penetration works. So when you take a look again, I just want to go through this quickly. We'll take a look with the German tank this time. So this Panther, right? If you're trying to penetrate a let's say you're trying to penetrate a T-34-85, right? We'll preview this real quick. We can see that the plate up here is only 45 millimeters thick. So yep, it's only a 45 millimeter thick plate. This driver port here is 75 millimeters thick though, and this is 65, but we'll just say, well, yeah, let's just say you're trying to hit this driver's port here, 75 millimeters thick, right? And this angle here is a 60-degree angle, so this is going to be your angle of attack. If you're shooting at this, is going to be 30 degrees, right? So let's take a look back at that Panther and see whether a shell would go through and at what ranges. So we're going to head over here, modifications. We'll take a look at this shell right here. We can see 30 millimeters at 100 or at 10 meters it goes through 83 millimeters. At 100 meters it goes through 82 millimeters. So at 500 meters, right, this shell will stop effectively going through the driver's hatch, right, 75 millimeters. However, this shell should go through any other part of the tank of that front plate for pretty much any distance you'll see in the game. However, what you guys will, I'm sure, be pointing out now is like, oh, but sometimes I shoot T-34s and it just bounces right off. It doesn't go through at all. This is the last mechanic I want to talk about, and that is angle of attack and the percentages of ricochet. So this is the only RNG mechanic in the game, and I think that's because it's honestly, I don't think that it would be feasible to implement it in a non-RNG way. But that's this angle of attack and ricochet system. So when you look at this, you can see for this shell, if you're hitting at an angle of 42 degrees or higher, so anywhere between 42 and 90 degrees, right, the chance of ricochet is 0. That shell's going to go through every single time, right? But we know that the T-34 plate from head on is closer to 30 degrees, right? And so with this shell, when we look at its 50% chance of ricochet, it's 27 degrees. So what we can assume is that that 30-degree plate is going to be a little less than 50%. So maybe we'll say 4 out of every 10 shots you fire will bounce off that plate, will ricochet, right? And so this is when you get those random ricochets. This is the system that determines it. And then at 19 degrees or lower, so anywhere between 0 to 19 degrees, there's a 100% chance of ricochet. So it doesn't matter about the thickness of the plate. Your round is going to bounce off the plate. And again, this is the angle of attack. So I've simplified things by just looking at the constructional angle and whether it was hitting from the direct front and the tank wasn't angled at all. But in a real battle, tanks are going to be angled slightly. There's going to be elevation changes and all of that sort. So it will impact those numbers even higher. And so this is where when you start looking at more modern tanks with more shell selection, we can see that it's not always the best idea to bring the shell with the highest penetration values, because you can see, for example, this armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding sabot round shell has a significantly lower chance of ricochet than, for example, let's take a look at the Heat FS, right? So the Heat FS, and I guess this isn't so significant. Modern rounds are a lot better at hitting angled armor, but it is a pretty big deal. So the Heat FS, yes, you do get 440 millimeters of penetration. So you might say, oh yeah, that has the highest penetration value, so I'll use that whenever I can't punch through something. But you have to also consider the fact that its chance of ricochet increases. So in this case, you have a 50% chance of ricocheting off of 18 millimeter, off of an 18 degree of an attack. Angle of attack versus this still has a 0% chance of ricochet at 18 degrees of attack. So those are things that you need to consider when you're choosing shells. And there's, I'm sure, a better example I can use. Perhaps we look over here, maybe. No, that's not what I meant to. I meant to hit modifications. Perhaps over here we can see. Let's see. Yeah, so here we can see that these rounds, well, I mean, it's not exactly... Yeah, I mean, it's just important to consider. Look at the chance of ricochet. If you are having trouble and your rounds are bouncing, take a look at that and make sure you're using the correct round. Because, like, for example, here, You could theoretically use this and make it through some plates, but you also have a super high chance of ricocheting. So even though you're going to lose out on the shell size and on the mass of the projectile by switching to this composite rigid, you're dropping several kilograms. Even though you're just losing out on that and probably losing out on some post-pen effects, the decrease in ricochet chances is probably worth it in this case. And that one, it also penetrates more too. But yeah, so these are all factors you need to consider because all of this gets taken into account. When you're attacking this thing, when you're attacking this tank and you're trying to hit, that angle, that's a ridiculous angle of attack to hit that plate. Your chances are you're going to ricochet every time. This front plate is not so much, but it's just something you need to keep in mind. And especially when things start to get angled and all that, the angle of attack is going to increase. So these are all important for calculating whether your shell will go through. Anyway, I'm just going to wrap things up. So remember, there's different types of armor. Cast homogeneous is slightly weaker than rolled homogeneous, and that's probably the most you'll need to know. And then on top of there being different armor, don't look at effective thickness. That number is a lie, basically. It just doesn't, it's not used at all in the calculations of whether something's going to penetrate. Instead, look directly at your shell type and look at how thick of a plate your shell can penetrate and at what angle. And this is what the game actually uses to take into account. So for those T-34s, they're plates at a 30-degree angle. If you're having trouble penetrating a T-34, its plate's 45 millimeters. So you need to have a shell that's capable of penetrating a 30-degree angle of attack more than 45 millimeters. And you can see that's the drop off for that number is pretty intense. That's a very high drop off. You're looking at more than 100 millimeters decrease in penetrating power at a lot of ranges. So and obviously this changes with different shells, and some lose more, some lose less, but these are important numbers to consider. And that's what the game uses, is that chart in the modification screen. It doesn't use effective thickness. So just look at the true thickness of the plate at the top and look at how much your shell can penetrate at that angle, and that's your best way of looking. Anyway, guys, I hope this was informative. If I missed anything or got anything wrong, let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something new, let me know as well. I mean, I really hope this helps you guys better understand how armor works in this game and how shell's penetration works in this game. And yeah, anyway, cheers everyone. Hope to see you guys in the next video.